This past year, a Sufjan Stevens album got adapted into a Broadway musical. That's right, the album Illinois by Sufjan Stevens got adapted into a stage play, and it was so good, it even won a Tony. The play was directed and choreographed by Justin Peck, who had worked with Sufjan on some other projects, but was also very renowned in the theater world. And when I heard the news, I was really surprised because I had never heard of an album being adapted into a musical. Now, unfortunately, I wasn't able to see the show myself, but I was able to see some of the TV performances they did, and I listened to the cast album. And from what I could see, their approach was really interesting. They had the cast kind of recreate and sing all the original songs from the album, but there's very detailed choreography. There's not really a lot of dialogue from what I understand. It's just dancing to this music, and the dancing is what tells the story. And it's a bit hard to really tell what it is just from what we have available to us, but everyone that's seen the show does say that it's amazing, and in true theater fashion, you just kind of have to be in the room to fully understand it. And of course, Justin Peck mainly being a choreographer, that's what really stood out to most people that have seen this show. It won the Tony for Best Choreography. So overall, the show went really well. And so that got me thinking, what if this became like a normal thing? What if this is Broadway's next big cash cow? What if they start adapting more albums into musicals? What other albums could be adapted into great stage shows? I had a lot of fun thinking about this, so I came up with 5 albums that I think would make for great musicals. I will say before we get into this, I'm mainly stuck with contemporary albums. There are a lot of classics that I just didn't even think about. For example, I was racking my head over which Dylan album would make for the best musical, and I couldn't come up with an answer. But at number 5, I got Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. And this one just seems kind of obvious because immediately when you press play on the first track, it kind of sounds like musical theater. And of course, once you get more into the album, We Cry Together is performed like musical theater more than a traditional song. But as a stage show, Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers really does have potential to be this sprawling epic about generational trauma and overcoming that. Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers is definitely a concept album, but there's not as concrete of a story to it as there is for something like Good Kid, Mad City, which I'm sure a lot of people think would belong here, and I get it, but I think that is more suited for a film adaptation than theater. But while there's not as concrete of a story, I think that leaves a lot of room for some interesting interpretation for whoever would adapt this into a stage play. I could easily imagine it starring a Kendrick Lamar type character as he's trying to be a good husband and a father, and we dive into different scenes into his past, like moments of his life with his father, with his mother, with his aunt, and then you pair those scenes with moments from his present, his relationship with his wife, with his kids, with himself as a figure in entertainment. I can imagine it being adapted similar to the Illinois show, where maybe there's just choreography over songs. Through dance, you play out a scene of young Kendrick with his father during father time, and then, of course, later on, you see how that trauma affects him with his relationship during We Cry Together. Your Kodak Black kind of character could act as a narrator throughout the whole show. Like, really, with the sound of this album, it kind of seems like an obvious adaptation to me, and honestly, that's why it's so low on this list. Not because it's bad, but almost like because it's obvious it would be good. Like, it's attached to Kendrick Lamar. It's kind of just built for this type of thing already. Like, I feel like I already know exactly what to expect from a Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers musical. I'm more interested in something with a little more risk to it. Now, this next pick is a little out there. It has a lot of risk to it, but that's what I like about it. Number 4, I got 1,000 Suns by Linkin Park. In case you've forgotten or don't know, because this wasn't the band's most popular album, but 1,000 Suns is a concept album about a nuclear apocalypse. And I know this album isn't held critically to the same standard as all the other albums in this video, but I have a very personal relationship with this album because this was the first time I was conscious that I was listening to a concept album. Like, this almost introduced me to the concept of a concept album. It's when I knew for the first time I was listening to a story that was being told in musical form, not literally, but metaphorically. But beyond that, just the idea of seeing a stage play set in a nuclear apocalypse, I've never seen anything like that before, or even heard of anything like that. And the more I think about it, the more I want it. And I feel like a lot of these songs have room for a big cast of musicians to all be singing them at the same time, similar to the Illinois cast album. It's also very helpful that the band itself has 2 vocalists, so you could have a few different people singing Chester's parts, and then you could have a rapper character doing Mike Shinoda's parts. And this album does tell the story of a nuclear apocalypse, but it is more metaphorical than literal, so there's a lot of room for a playwright to take a lot of liberties into creating specific characters around this music. So unlike Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers, I really wouldn't know what I was getting going into an A Thousand Suns musical. I feel like there's a lot of cool opportunities to do things that have never been done in theater before with an A Thousand Suns musical. But in number 3, we got Louie by Kenny Beats. Louie, of course, is an interesting pick because this is a mostly instrumental album. But I'm gonna get into why I think this works, because the more I think about the Louie musical, the more I want it. So Kenny Beats is a music producer, and he had stated multiple times that he was never going to release an album himself because he just didn't have anything to say. Then out of nowhere, he just drops Louie. And the story behind this album is he started making it when he learned his dad was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Now, his dad was a radio DJ, and he's who introduced Kenny Beats to music and essentially shaped his musical taste just through the sheer variety of songs that he would play around his son. And so he made this album where each song is supposed to feel like the mixtapes that Kenny Sr. would make for his son. And even though the album was created as a tribute to him during a really dark time, it's not a dark sounding album. It is just bright and uplifting and fun. And here is why I think it could be a great musical. Because there is this great backstory to this album that I think could serve as the backbone. And since it's a mostly instrumental album, there's a lot of room for a writer to create their own characters. But how I would adapt this as a musical is I would frame it as you have a Kenny Beats type character in present day who is going through his dad's old records, or maybe he's in the radio station that his dad used to broadcast from, and he pulls out different records that he remembers from his childhood, or maybe he pulls out some mixtapes that his dad made for him. He puts one in the cassette player or on the record player, he presses play, and then you're immediately taken to a new scene. And we get a live rendition of each song on this album, and each song on the album represents a different memory that Kenny had with his father. For example, the first song would play, we would have a very young actor playing a young Kenny, and we would get the story of how he got his nickname Louie, which is told in this little book that came with the vinyl. And with each new song, we would slowly watch Kenny grow up and get older as we would tell a new story with his dad throughout his life. And maybe during the adaptation process, it could be like specifically about Kenny Beats, or we could take some liberties with it and just make it a really touching father and son story. And we keep on coming back to the present day Kenny as he's reflecting back on these memories with his dad while listening to his old music. So there's almost like an after sun quality to it where it's about an adult looking back at childhood memories, but now that he is the same age as he remembers his dad being, he kind of understands them differently, and he realizes all the things that his father was going through. So this has a lot of potential to be just a really heartfelt story about our relationship with our parents and how much a good parent sacrifices for us in ways that we don't even realize until we get older, and how a good parent can kind of shape us and set us up for success. And if you watch the NPR Tiny Desk performance that he did, the live renditions of this music is incredible. It would be amazing to hear the whole album front to back performed live. And another thing that sets this up for a musical really well is there are guest appearances from different artists on these songs, and each one of those appearances could be performed by a different cast member. So each cast member that's singing or rapping in the songs that have vocals can be a main character in the specific scene that we're creating around that song. So a coming-of-age father-son story told from the perspective of a grown-up son remembering his father through the music that they listen to together, combined with live performances of the entire Louis album. The more I talk about this, the more I want this Broadway show to actually happen. And at number 2, we have I Didn't Mean to Haunt You by Quedeca. Now, this is just one of my favorite albums, but despite it having amazing production and performances, it's a very story-driven album, which I think would lend to it being adapted to a play really well. I Didn't Mean to Haunt You is a really sad, but also kind of hauntingly beautiful album. It's about a guy that's struggling with depression and ends up taking his own life, but then he haunts his house as a ghost, and he watches how his family deals with his passing. And if you haven't heard this album, you should definitely give it a listen, but without getting into too much detail of what the story is, I definitely think there's enough there that there are very specific story beats that could be recreated for the stage play, but there's also still some room for some creative liberty about who specifically the main character is, his specific relationship with his family. There's also so much room for world building with what the afterlife looks like, because our character hasn't moved on completely past this life, but he's also not fully present in this life either. And the art direction behind this album was incredible with the artwork and the music videos. There was a full album film, just like a visualizer that was made to go along with this. So there's a lot of imagery. There's even a specific wardrobe for the ghost character that we could borrow for the stage play. There's so much that's already there. I don't think it would be too hard to take what we already have and just adapt it to the stage format. I can imagine a split stage where half of it is the normal world, our world, where we see the house where his family lives, and then the other half is kind of what's beyond, this place where he's not quite gone, but not quite here either. And in the middle, we could kind of have this door that he's banging on or like looking into, trying to get into his house. I don't know, I'm just spitballing, but I could picture it pretty clearly what this would look like, just there is so much art already attached to this album. We know what the color palette is. We know what the mood is. We know what the costumes look like. And there's a pretty detailed story already attached to this album. I think all of those things lend to this being a good stage show. Plus, the production on this album is already so unique. It already does half the work of just reeling you into this weird otherworldly place. Like, it would work in tandem with the sets and the costumes and the actors really well. Plus, I've seen this album performed live, and the live renditions of these songs are really special too. So the experience of hearing this music performed live while also seeing the story performed, it would just be a great show. But at number 1, the album that I think is the best set up to be adapted into a Broadway musical is Flower Boy by Tyler, the Creator. Flower Boy was a really important album for Tyler, the Creator. It's basically what established him as the boundary-pushing artist that we have right now. It represents him stepping into a more mature direction from the music he made when he was a kid. But out of all of the albums I've listened to, I think second only to Good Kid, Mad City, which again I think is more suited for a film adaptation, Flower Boy has the most detailed story. Flower Boy is essentially a queer coming-of-age story where Tyler wants to confess feelings for this other guy, but doesn't know how to. And there are just very many specific story beats in this album that, like, as a writer, I would just know exactly where to place in a script. And the lyrics in this album just very directly tell the story, to the point where I could imagine a stage adaptation of this album pretty much being carried just by one guy, just by our Tyler the Creator character, performing most of the music, while a lot of the contributions from Rex Orange County and Frank Ocean and everyone else on this album could be performed by a chorus and ensemble of other cast members. But not only are there specific story beats, there's specific locations. You have Tyler in his car, you have Tyler at the garden shed. I can just visualize it very clearly, like how you would structure a script around this music. And there's a lot of room to write additional dialogue and kind of expound on the things that Tyler is already telling us about. Just that specificity of what's going on, when it's going on, and where you are while it's happening just is present in Flower Boy, where it's not in a lot of other albums. Like, even Igor, I think a lot of people would probably place above this, but I could picture it more clearly what the Flower Boy musical would be, not to mention that the music is perfect to be performed live, and similar to the Quedeca album, there is so much existing art direction for this album. You just need to look at all of his live shows, and I think this is what particularly puts this over the edge and places it at number one. Is Tyler's art direction just seems ready-made for a stage production. If you look at a lot of Tyler's art direction, but specifically in this era, he's essentially hip-hop's Wes Anderson. A lot of it's really flat, really storybook-like. It just instantly transports you into another world, but there's still room for creativity. Like, a big part of this album is Tyler being in the car, so how you would create those driving scenes on stage could be really interesting. And I know I said it before, but the music just sounds beautiful performed live. Again, you could look at his Tiny Desk performance. You could look at any performances from his live shows. But I think when you just boil down all of the elements of Tyler's artistry, he just has so much specificity that this album just seems uniquely prepared for a musical adaptation. So those are the 5 albums that I think could be musicals. And who knows, maybe after the success of Illinois, Broadway will start looking to other albums as inspiration for some new musicals, because for the love of God, I just wish they would stop adapting movies. So maybe this could be a good future for Broadway. Maybe albums carry enough name recognition that they could sell tickets, but there's still room for some creativity. But these are just 5 albums, and these are 5 pretty recent albums. So if you have an album that you think would make for a great stage show, leave a comment. Thank you so much for watching. You can follow me everywhere at Robert2_Isaac. I'm also a filmmaker, and I have a filmmaking channel called Written By. You can follow that at Written By Pod. We're dropping podcasts, we're dropping short films. I have a short film called Evil Vinyl 1982 that is about a music YouTuber that was shot on this set. So if that interests you, that's on that channel. There's also a link in the description. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.